and how CD's skip-free music made tape decks sound broken. In 1982, Sony and Philips unleashed what they called perfect sound forever onto an unsuspecting world. The compact disc promised something that seemed almost magical after decades of analog audio. Music without hiss, without wow and flutter, without the gradual degradation that plagued every vinyl record and cassette tape. But what Sony and Philips didn't advertise was that their digital revolution would make every existing audio format sound fundamentally broken. By 1985, anyone who heard a CD and then returned to their cassette deck experienced something profound and unsettling. The tape didn't just sound inferior, it sounded damaged, defective, like someone had deliberately sabotaged their music. The compact cassette, which had dominated portable music for 2 decades and sold over 100 billion units worldwide, was about to be exposed as a fundamentally flawed technology that consumers had simply accepted because they didn't know better. This wasn't just technological progress, this was an entire industry discovering that their flagship product had been broken all along. The compact cassette had ruled the music industry for good reason. Introduced by Philips in 1963, it revolutionized how people consumed music by making it portable, affordable, and recordable. By 1983, cassette sales had surpassed vinyl records for the first time, generating over $4 billion in revenue annually. The Sony Walkman, launched in 1979, had sold over 30 million units by 1985, turning cassette tapes into a cultural phenomenon that defined the soundtrack of the 80s. Major record labels were pressing millions of pre-recorded cassettes, and the home recording boom had created a secondary market worth billions. Blank cassette sales alone generated over $2 billion per year by the mid-80s. The technology seemed invincible, supported by massive manufacturing infrastructure, universal compatibility, and consumer habits built over decades. TDK, Maxell, and dozens of other manufacturers had invested hundreds of millions in cassette production facilities worldwide. But beneath this commercial success lurked technical limitations that would prove fatal once consumers heard the alternative. The fundamental problem with cassette tapes wasn't immediately obvious because it was all anyone knew. Magnetic tape recording inherently introduced several forms of distortion that became synonymous with recorded music itself. Wow and flutter, the slight variations in playback speed caused by mechanical imperfections in tape transport mechanisms, typically measured between 0.1 and 0.4% on consumer decks. This meant that sustained musical notes would subtly waver in pitch, creating a warbling effect that became part of the expected sound signature. Tape hiss, the random noise generated by the magnetic coating itself, operated at around -50 decibels on standard cassettes, creating a constant background presence that listeners learned to mentally filter out. Frequency response limitations meant that most consumer cassette decks couldn't accurately reproduce frequencies below 40 Hz or above 15 kHz, truncating both the deep bass and crystal clear highs that existed in the original recordings. Dynamic range, the difference between the loudest and quietest sounds, was compressed to roughly 50 decibels compared to the original master recordings, which often exceeded 70 decibels. But perhaps most insidiously, tape recordings degraded with every play, as the magnetic coating gradually shed microscopic particles, slowly but permanently eroding the music. When the first compact disc players reached American stores in March 1983 with a retail price of $730, they represented the most significant leap in audio technology since the invention of electrical recording in 1925. The CD specification, jointly developed by Sony and Philips, delivered 16-bit digital audio sampled at 44.1 kHz, providing a theoretical frequency response from 5 Hz to 22 kHz, with a dynamic range exceeding 90 decibels. More importantly, the digital format eliminated every single problem that plagued analog recording. There was no wow and flutter because there were no moving mechanical parts contacting the music surface. There was no background hiss because digital audio represented sound as discrete numerical values rather than analog waveforms subject to electromagnetic interference. There was no frequency response limitation within the audible spectrum, and no degradation from repeated playback. because laser light reading digital data couldn't physically wear down the disc surface. Early CD players also featured sophisticated error correction systems that could reconstruct perfect audio even when the disc had minor scratches or dust particles. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was revolutionary. The audio industry initially tried to position CDs as a premium alternative rather than a cassette replacement. Early marketing emphasized CD's suitability for classical music and serious listening, while cassettes remained positioned as the format for portable music and casual listening. Major labels hedged their bets by continuing massive cassette production while slowly building CD catalogs. But consumer behavior told a different story. By 1985, anyone who owned both formats began experiencing what audio engineers called format shock, the jarring transition from CD's pristine clarity back to cassette's analog limitations. Suddenly, the tape hiss that had been mentally filtered out became glaringly obvious, an intrusive presence that seemed to smother the music. The wow and flutter that had been unconsciously accepted as part of the listening experience now sounded like mechanical failure. Bass frequencies that had always seemed adequate on cassette now sounded muffled and indistinct compared to CD's full-range reproduction. The compressed dynamic range that had never seemed problematic now made music sound flat and lifeless. Most devastating of all, consumers began noticing the cumulative damage to their tape collections. Favorite cassettes that had been played hundreds of times now exhibited obvious high-frequency loss and increased noise levels that became impossible to ignore once they knew what undamaged music should sound like. The compact disc's market penetration accelerated far beyond industry projections. CD player prices dropped from $730 in 1983 to under $200 by 1987, while the number of available CD titles exploded from 800 in 1983 to over 8,000 by 1986. By 1988, CD sales had reached 150 million units annually, generating over $2 billion in revenue. Meanwhile, cassette sales plateaued and then began declining for the first time since the format's introduction. The portability advantage that had been cassette's greatest strength was being systematically eroded. Portable CD players, though initially bulky and expensive, became increasingly sophisticated with better anti-shock systems and longer battery life. Car CD players, virtually non-existent in 1985, were installed in over 30% of new vehicles by 1990. Home stereo systems began featuring CD players as standard equipment, while cassette decks were relegated to secondary status or eliminated entirely. The recording industry noticed something unprecedented. Consumers were repurchasing music they already owned in cassette format, simply to experience it without analog artifacts. This replacement cycle generated billions in unexpected revenue as music buyers rebuilt their collections in digital format. By the early 1990s, cassette manufacturers found themselves in an impossible position. No amount of engineering refinement could overcome the fundamental limitations of analog magnetic recording. Companies like Nakamichi spent millions developing exotic three-head deck designs with precision transport mechanisms and advanced noise reduction systems, achieving wow and flutter specifications below 0.05% and signal-to-noise ratios approaching 70 decibels with Dolby HX Pro. But even the most expensive cassette deck costing over $1,000 couldn't match the technical performance of a $150 CD player. Sony introduced the revolutionary metal tape formulation, TDK developed advanced metal particle technology, and Dolby created increasingly sophisticated noise reduction systems including Dolby B, C, and S. These innovations could marginally improve cassette performance, but they also increased complexity and cost while still falling short of CD quality. More problematically, each enhancement created new compatibility issues. Metal tapes required specially designed recording circuits. Dolby noise reduction required encoding and decoding with identical systems, and high-bias formulations often didn't play properly on older equipment. The industry was trying to perfect an inherently flawed technology while competing against a format that had solved the fundamental problems entirely. The death spiral accelerated through the 1990s, as digital technology became cheaper and more sophisticated. DAT, Sony's digital audio tape format introduced in 1987, offered CD-quality recording but was deliberately crippled by record industry lawsuits over copying concerns and never gained consumer acceptance. Instead, the compact disc completely monopolized the high-quality audio market, while cassettes were relegated to increasingly marginal applications. Portable CD players with advanced anti-skip protection became standard by the mid-90s, eliminating the last technical advantage of cassette portability. Car manufacturers stopped installing cassette players in premium vehicles, and by 1995, many new car stereos featured only CD players and radio. The home recording market, which had sustained blank cassette sales for decades, was being eroded by digital alternatives and would eventually be completely destroyed by computer-based recording and MP3 technology. Cassette manufacturing facilities that had operated profitably for decades began shutting down as demand collapsed. BASF closed its cassette production line in 1996, followed by dozens of smaller manufacturers. Retail stores reduced cassette floor space and eventually eliminated cassette sections entirely. What had once been a $10 billion global industry was contracting rapidly toward irrelevance. The psychological impact of this transition extended far beyond simple format preference. Consumers who experienced high-quality digital audio found it increasingly difficult to tolerate analog artifacts that they had previously accepted unconsciously. This phenomenon, which audio psychologists term quality threshold adjustment, meant that cassette tapes didn't just sound inferior to CDs, they sounded objectively broken, defective in ways that became impossible to ignore. The tape hiss that had been part of the ambient listening experience now sounded like equipment malfunction. Speed variations that had been unconsciously accepted as natural now sounded like mechanical failure requiring repair. Frequency response limitations that had never been noticed became glaringly obvious gaps in the musical spectrum. Most significantly, the gradual degradation inherent in repeated cassette playback, which had always been accepted as inevitable, now seemed like a fundamental design flaw that made the format unsuitable for preserving valuable music collections. Consumers began treating their cassette libraries as temporary, expendable media while rebuilding permanent collections in CD format. This represented a complete reversal of cassette's traditional value proposition as an affordable alternative to expensive vinyl records. The compact cassette's collapse represented more than just technological obsolescence. It demonstrated how digital innovation could retroactively expose the hidden limitations of established analog technologies. Between 1985 and 2000, global cassette production fell from over 3 billion units annually to less than 500 million, while CD production exploded to over 2.5 billion units per year by 1999. Major record labels stopped pressing new releases on cassette by 1998, and most consumer electronics manufacturers discontinued cassette deck production by 2000. The infrastructure that had supported a global cassette industry worth tens of billions was systematically dismantled as demand evaporated. But the real industry killshot wasn't just commercial displacement. It was the psychological transformation that made analog tape artifacts sound like broken equipment to anyone who had experienced digital alternatives. Perfect Sound Forever wasn't just marketing hyperbole, it was a new baseline that made all previous audio formats seem fundamentally defective. The compact disc had accomplished something unprecedented in consumer electronics history. It had made a successful, established technology sound broken simply by existing. In the digital age, analog wasn't just obsolete, it was audibly damaged, and once consumers heard the difference, there was no going back to accepting the limitations they had never realized they were enduring.